The last bus had been gone for 40 minutes, but the German Shepherd was still waiting. Rain fell hard over Millhaven, turning the narrow streets silver beneath the amber glow of old lamps. Water streamed from the rusted roof of bus stop 17 and gathered in dark pools around the dog's paws. He sat beneath the shelter without moving, his sable coat soaked nearly black, his ears lowered against the cold, his amber eyes fixed on the empty road beyond the glass. Every few seconds, he lifted his head at the distant hum of an engine. Every time, the sound faded somewhere behind the hills. It was 11:47 on a Thursday night in late October, and the temperature had dropped to 42 degrees. The station clock had stopped at 6:15 months ago, its hands frozen beneath cracked plastic, but the dog still looked up at it as though it were keeping a promise. His name was Atlas. The people of Millhaven knew that now. They knew the nick in his left ear, the worn leather collar around his neck, and the quiet way he refused food until the last Route 17 bus had opened its doors. They knew he never chased cars, never wandered downtown, never followed strangers home. He only waited. Nora Bell, the night custodian, pushed a yellow mop bucket across the station floor and watched him through the fogged window. She was 58, with tired blue eyes and a red wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck. For 3 weeks, she had left a bowl of water beside the bench and a folded towel near the door. Atlas drank when she stepped away. He never touched the towel. That night, the wind changed. Rain blew sideways beneath the shelter, striking the metal bench with a thin, steady tapping. Nora opened the station door and called softly, "Come inside, boy." Atlas did not turn. She stepped closer, boots squeaking against the wet concrete. "There's no one else coming." His head shifted then, but only toward the road. Nora followed his gaze. Nothing moved beyond the curtain of rain. She reached for his collar, hoping to guide him beneath the warm fluorescent lights. A low sound rose from his chest. Not a snarl, not a warning meant to harm. It was grief with teeth around it. Nora stopped. Atlas moved one step sideways and placed himself between her and the empty end of the bench. That was when she saw what he had been guarding. Beneath the seat, protected from the worst of the rain by his body, lay a bus ticket folded into quarters. The paper was soft with age, its edges curled and stained, but the printed name was still readable. Daniel Mercer. The return date was March 14th. The arrival time was 6:15 p.m. Nora crouched slowly, careful not to reach for it. "Daniel," she whispered. Atlas's ears rose. For the first time all night, his tail struck the wet pavement once. Then headlights appeared at the far end of Main Street. Atlas stood so quickly the bench rattled behind him. An unscheduled bus rolled through the rain, brakes sighing as it stopped beneath the broken clock. The doors opened. A tall man in a dark Marine Corps jacket stepped down onto the sidewalk. Atlas took one trembling step forward. Then he froze. The man looked at him with gentle confusion. He was not Daniel. The stranger in the Marine Corps jacket gave Atlas a careful nod, then stepped aside as the bus doors folded shut behind him. Atlas watched the vehicle pull away, its red lights dissolving into the rain, and the hope that had lifted his body seemed to drain back into the pavement. Nora saw it happen. His ears lowered. His tail went still. He returned to the bench and sat beside the ticket as though disappointment were simply another weather he had learned to endure. 8 months earlier, before the rain became part of his life, Atlas had lived with Daniel Mercer in a small white house 3 miles outside Millhaven. The house stood near a line of maple trees, with a narrow porch, a gravel driveway, and a wooden flagpole Daniel had built with his own hands. Daniel was 37, a former United States Marine with broad shoulders, close-cropped brown hair, and pale skin weathered by years beneath hard sun. A faint scar curved along his left jaw, but it was his eyes people remembered. Gray-blue, steady, tired in a way sleep could not fix. Atlas understood those eyes better than anyone. On difficult nights, Daniel would wake before dawn with his breath caught high in his chest and his hands gripping the edge of the mattress. Atlas never barked. He would place one paw against Daniel's boot, then press his muzzle gently into the man's palm until the room became a room again. "I am here," Daniel would whisper. Sometimes he meant Atlas. Sometimes he meant himself. They had been together for 5 years, first through training, then service, then the strange quiet that came after Daniel returned home. Atlas knew the sound of Daniel's truck from half a mile away. Daniel knew the difference between Atlas's hungry whine and the softer sound he made when thunder rolled over the hills. They moved through each day like two halves of the same habit. Then, in early March, a letter arrived from a veteran support center in Richmond, Virginia. They wanted Daniel to help former service members struggling to rebuild ordinary lives. It was the first offer that had made him sit upright at the kitchen table. It was also temporary. 3 days of orientation. Then he would return for Atlas once housing was arranged. Michael Reed, an old Marine friend who lived across town, agreed to keep the dog. On the morning Daniel left, frost silvered the porch rails. Atlas stood beside the truck, watching the suitcase disappear behind the seat. Daniel crouched in front of him and removed the worn dog tag from beneath his shirt. With a small pair of pliers, he bent the thin metal until it broke into 2 uneven pieces. He threaded one half onto Atlas's collar and closed his hand around the other. "So neither of us gets lost," he said. Atlas leaned forward and touched his nose to Daniel's chin. Daniel smiled, but his eyes shone. At Michael's house, Atlas refused to enter until Daniel walked inside first. Daniel stayed for 10 minutes, then 20. Finally, he knelt near the front steps and held Atlas by both sides of his face. "Friday," he said. 6:15. Bus 17. I will come back for you." Atlas stared at him, listening with the solemn attention he once gave commands. Daniel stood, took 3 steps toward the waiting car, then turned back. Atlas had not moved. "That is a promise, partner." The car carried Daniel away beneath a pale morning sky. Atlas remained at the curb long after the sound of the engine was gone, the broken half of the dog tag resting against his chest. Friday arrived beneath a low ceiling of gray clouds. Atlas spent the morning beside Michael Reed's front window, watching every car that passed along Cedar Avenue. At noon, he ignored his food. At 3, he began pacing between the door and the clock above the fireplace. Michael tried to calm him with a familiar command, but Atlas only looked toward the street. By 5:30, the dog was standing at the front door with his leash in his mouth. Michael had known Daniel long enough to understand promises between Marines, but he was only beginning to understand promises made to dogs. He drove Atlas to the Millhaven station through a light spring rain. The town was settling into evening, storefronts glowing behind damp glass, tires whispering over wet pavement. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, the broken dog tag tapping softly against his collar whenever the truck turned. At 6:12, they reached bus stop 17. Atlas pulled Michael toward the shelter and planted himself beside the bench. 3 minutes later, the bus appeared around the corner. Its brakes released a long sigh. The doors opened. A woman carrying grocery bags stepped down. Then an elderly man in a tan coat. Then a college student wearing headphones. Atlas rose higher with each figure, searching past them into the yellow-lit aisle. No one else came. The driver glanced down at him before closing the doors. "Waiting on somebody?" he asked. Michael swallowed. "Yes." The bus pulled away. Atlas remained standing. Michael checked his phone. No message. He called Daniel once, then again. Both calls went unanswered. At 6:48, the phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Michael answered immediately, but for several seconds there was only wind, rain, and the distant sound of traffic. Then Daniel spoke. His voice was strained, though he tried to make it sound ordinary. "I am almost there." "Where are you?" Michael asked. "Near the old bridge. The bus connection was canceled. I found a ride." A horn sounded somewhere behind him. Tires hissed across wet road. "Daniel, stay where you are. I will come get you." "No," Daniel said. "Atlas is waiting." Michael looked toward the dog. Atlas had turned at the sound of Daniel's voice coming through the phone. His ears stood high. "He knows," Michael said quietly. "Just tell him I am coming." There was a sharp burst of static. Daniel began to say something else, but the call ended. Michael called back. Nothing. He waited 10 minutes, then 20. The rain grew heavier. At 7:30, he led Atlas to the truck, promising they would return in the morning. Atlas resisted until Michael played Daniel's last words from the voicemail notification. Then the dog climbed inside, but he never looked away from the road. Before dawn, a state trooper knocked on Michael's door. Daniel's truck had been found near the old bridge, angled beside the shoulder with the driver's door open. His suitcase was still inside. So was the other half of the dog tag, resting in the cup holder beside an untouched bus ticket. There was no sign of Daniel. Search teams followed the roadside for miles. They checked the riverbank, nearby farms, and every building within walking distance. By sunset, the official word was missing. Michael did not say that word near Atlas, but dogs hear what people try to hide. That night, Atlas stood beneath the window and listened to Michael speak quietly with the trooper in the kitchen. Daniel's name. The bridge. No trace. Atlas turned toward the back door. Michael noticed too late. The screen had been pushed open, and muddy paw prints crossed the porch. 3 miles away, under the station clock frozen at 6:15, Atlas sat beside the empty bench and began to wait. By sunrise, Michael found Atlas beneath the shelter, soaked through and staring toward the eastbound lane. He brought a blanket, a bowl of water, and the leash Daniel had left behind. Atlas drank, allowed the blanket across his back, then refused to move. Michael stayed until the first bus arrived. Atlas stood when the doors opened. When Daniel did not appear, he sat again. That became the shape of the days that followed. At first, Michael drove him home each night and brought him back before 6:15. Then Atlas began slipping out on his own, following the same 3-mile route through side streets, across the park, and past the old Methodist church. He never missed the evening bus. On the 17th day, the station workers stopped calling animal control. On the 32nd, Nora Bell began leaving a stainless steel bowl beneath the bench. On the 49th, a second-grade girl named Lily placed a red scarf around Atlas's neck because the wind had turned cold. He wore it until the rain washed the color pale. Search teams continued looking for Daniel. Flyers appeared in grocery stores, diners, and gas stations across 3 counties. Michael called hospitals, shelters, and veteran centers. Every answer was the same. No Daniel Mercer. No man matching his description. No explanation for an open truck, an untouched ticket, and half a dog tag left behind. Summer came slowly. Heat rose from the pavement in trembling waves, and the metal bench grew too hot to touch. Atlas moved into the narrow strip of shade beneath the route map, but at 6:12, he always returned to the curb. Bus 17 would arrive with its tired engine and folding doors. Atlas would stand. Strangers would descend carrying backpacks, lunch boxes, flowers, sometimes sleeping children. The driver would wait an extra moment. Then the doors would close. Atlas would sit. By day 103, the whole town knew his routine. Some people brought food. Others took photographs. Atlas accepted neither attention nor pity. He watched the road. Autumn arrived with leaves gathering around his paws. His coat lost its summer shine. Rachel Bennett, the local veterinarian, examined him beside the shelter and found that he had lost 14 pounds. His heartbeat was steady, but his lungs sounded strained after too many cold nights. "He cannot keep doing this," she told Michael. Michael looked at the empty road. "Tell him that." Rachel knelt and offered Atlas a piece of warm chicken. He sniffed it, then turned away when the station clock reached 6:14. The bus came. Daniel did not. That evening marked day 147. Rain swept across Millhaven after dark, and the temperature fell below 45 degrees. Nora stayed past the end of her shift, watching Atlas shiver beneath the shelter. He had refused breakfast, lunch, and the broth she brought from the diner. His eyes remained clear, but his body looked tired enough to surrender. At 10:20, a late passenger hurried through the station and left a dark green field jacket draped across a chair. Nora called after him, but he had already climbed into a taxi. She carried the jacket toward the lost and found cabinet. Atlas rose before she reached the door. His nose lifted. One breath, then another. The weariness vanished from his posture. He crossed the station floor and pressed his muzzle into the jacket sleeve, inhaling deeply. A sound escaped him, soft and broken. Nora froze. Sewn inside the collar was a faded name strip. Mercer. Atlas seized the cuff gently and pulled toward the exit. In the pocket, Nora found a discharge paper from a veterans rehabilitation center in Ashford, 36 miles away. The patient name had been left blank. The admission date was the morning after Daniel disappeared. Nora called Michael before midnight. He arrived 10 minutes later, rain shining across the shoulders of his brown work coat, and stopped when he saw Atlas standing beside the field jacket. The dog had one paw pressed over the sleeve, as though guarding the last warm trace of Daniel's scent. Michael read the discharge paper twice. Ashford Veterans Rehabilitation Center, 36 miles east. Admission date, March 15th, the morning after Daniel vanished. Why was there no name? Nora asked. Michael looked at the faded jacket, then at Atlas. Maybe he could not give them one. They left before dawn. Rachel came with them after hearing Atlas cough in the station parking lot. She wrapped him in a dry blanket across the back seat, but he would not lie down. He stood between the front seats, nose lifted toward the jacket folded in Michael's lap. The highway to Ashford ran through dark farmland and low wooded hills. Rain tapped against the windshield. Every few miles, Atlas shifted his weight as though willing the truck forward. The rehabilitation center appeared just after sunrise, a long brick building surrounded by bare oak trees and pale security lights. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, floor wax, and antiseptic. A nurse named Claire Dawson listened as Michael explained. Her expression changed when he showed her Daniel's photograph. She led them to a quiet office and opened a thin file. A man was brought here on March 15th, she said. A road crew found him walking near a service road outside Ashford. He was confused, exhausted, and unable to remember his name. Michael gripped the edge of the desk. Was it him? Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned the file around. A small intake photograph was clipped to the first page. The man in the picture was thinner, his hair longer, a healing mark near his temple. But the eyes were unmistakable. Gray-blue. Tired. Daniel. Michael sat back as if the room had shifted beneath him. Nora covered her mouth. Atlas pressed against the office door, whining for the first time since they arrived. Why did no one contact us? Michael asked. Claire lowered her voice. He had no identification. He could not remember Millhaven, the Marine Corps, or anyone named Daniel. We circulated his description, but he was transferred here under an unknown patient status. He chose the name David because it felt familiar. Can we see him? Claire glanced toward Atlas. There is something you need to know. Loud sounds upset him. Sudden movement, too. He becomes anxious around barking dogs. Rachel looked down at Atlas, whose chest rose with shallow breaths beneath the blanket. He is not well enough for a long wait. Claire arranged a meeting in a sunroom at the end of the east wing. Through the glass doors, Daniel sat beside a window overlooking the wet courtyard. He wore a gray sweater and held a paper cup between both hands. His shoulders were narrower. His face had changed in small ways grief often changes a face, quietly, from the inside. Michael whispered his name. Daniel looked up. No recognition came. Then Atlas saw him. The dog's entire body went still. His ears lifted. His breath caught. For one suspended second, every mile, every cold night, every empty bus seemed to fall away. Atlas moved toward the door. Daniel noticed him and rose too quickly, knocking the cup from his hands. It struck the floor and rolled beneath a chair. Fear crossed his face. Please, he said, stepping back. Atlas stopped. The room went silent except for rain against the windows. He did not bark. He did not rush forward. He lowered himself onto the floor several yards away, placed his head between his paws, and watched Daniel with the same patience he had carried to bus stop 17 for 147 nights. Daniel stayed near the window, one hand gripping the back of a chair as though the room had tilted beneath him. Atlas did not move. Rain slid down the glass in crooked lines, and somewhere in the hallway a cartwheel squeaked against the polished floor. Michael wanted to speak, to explain everything at once, but Claire raised a quiet hand. Let him choose the distance, she said. Daniel looked from the dog to the people gathered near the door. You know him? He asked. Michael swallowed. His name is Atlas. The name passed through the room without landing anywhere Daniel could reach. He shook his head. I am sorry. Atlas's ears lowered, but he remained in place. Rachel watched the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The dog had crossed 36 miles before sunrise, carried by a hope his body was no longer strong enough to support. Still, he waited. Daniel sat slowly. Atlas mirrored him, lifting his head but keeping several yards between them. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Claire brought fresh coffee. Nora stood near the wall, twisting the end of her red scarf. Michael told Daniel simple things, never too much at once. The White House outside Millhaven. The maple trees. The porch Daniel had repaired last summer. The way Atlas slept across the bedroom door during thunderstorms. Daniel listened politely, like a man hearing details from someone else's life. I wish I remembered, he said. Atlas rose at the sound of his voice. He took one step forward. Daniel's shoulders tightened. Atlas stopped immediately and sat. That restraint changed something. Daniel studied him more carefully. The torn edge of his left ear, the faded red scarf, the half-tag resting against his wet chest. "He has been waiting for you," Nora said softly. Michael closed his eyes. The words felt too heavy for the room. Daniel looked toward the ring. "I do not know how to be the man he remembers." Atlas gave a low breath and lowered his head again. He seemed to understand that this was another kind of absence. Not a missing road. Not an empty bus. A locked door inside someone he loved. Afternoon light faded behind the clouds. Rachel finally knelt beside Atlas and touched the side of his neck. His temperature was rising. "We need to take him to the clinic soon," she said. Michael nodded, but Atlas refused the leash when Daniel shifted in his chair. The dog's gaze followed every small movement. Daniel noticed. "Does he always watch me like that?" "He used to watch the whole world for you," Michael said. Silence settled again. Then a metal tray slipped from a nurse's hands in the corridor. It struck the floor with a sudden crash. Daniel flinched hard, breath catching, both hands rising toward his face. Before anyone else could move, Atlas crossed the room. He stayed low, slow, careful. He pressed his body against Daniel's knees and touched his muzzle to the man's left hand once. Then again. Then a third time. Daniel froze. His breathing remained sharp for several seconds, but Atlas did not move. The old rhythm found him before memory did. One touch. Breathe. 2 touches. Look down. 3 touches. Stay here. Daniel's fingers opened. They settled behind Atlas's left ear, directly over the small notch in the fur. His hand knew the place. His eyes filled before his mind understood why. Atlas lifted his face. The broken tag tapped softly against Daniel's wrist. Daniel stared at it, then reached into the pocket of the green field jacket folded beside him. His fingers closed around a small piece of metal the staff had returned with his belongings. He placed it against the half on Atlas's collar. The edges matched. The room disappeared from Daniel's face. "Atlas," he whispered. The dog leaned forward until his forehead rested against Daniel's chest. Daniel bent over him, one hand gripping the wet fur at his shoulders. "You waited," he said. Atlas closed his eyes. Daniel's voice broke into something smaller than speech. "So did you." Daniel stayed bent over Atlas, one hand resting against the dog's shoulders, the other holding the two halves of the tag together. No one in the room spoke. The rain softened against the windows, and the gray light beyond the glass began to warm at the edges. Atlas lifted his head and searched Daniel's face. Recognition had returned, but not all at once. It came in fragments. A porch under summer rain. The smell of pine soap on wet fur. A boot beside a narrow bed. A quiet breath in the dark. Daniel closed his eyes as the memories passed through him, small and bright, too fragile to hold for long. "The house," he said. Michael stepped closer. "Outside Millhaven." Daniel nodded slowly. "Maple trees." His fingers moved behind Atlas's left ear. "He sleeps by the door when it storms." Atlas's tail struck the floor once. The sound was soft, but everyone heard it. Nora turned toward the window and pressed her hand over her mouth. Claire lowered her eyes. Michael let out a breath he had been carrying for 8 months. Daniel looked down at the faded red scarf around Atlas's neck. "That is not mine." Nora managed a smile. "A little girl gave it to him. She thought he looked cold." Daniel touched the cloth carefully. His face tightened with the weight of every night he had not been there. "How long?" Michael did not answer at first. 147 days. Daniel's hand stopped. Atlas leaned into him as though the number meant nothing. As though love did not count time the way people did. Daniel whispered, "I left him." "No," Michael said. "You were trying to come back." Daniel looked at him. He did not know that. Atlas shifted closer and placed one paw across Daniel's shoe. The gesture was so familiar that Daniel almost laughed. The sound caught in his throat and became a quiet sob instead. He lowered his forehead to Atlas's. "I am sorry, partner." Atlas breathed against his cheek. No accusation. No hesitation. Only the same steady presence that had carried them through other dark rooms. Rachel watched the dog's sides rise too quickly. The reunion had filled the space with warmth, but Atlas's body remained weak. She moved closer and placed her hand against his chest. His breathing sounded rougher now. "We need to go," she said. Daniel looked up. "What is wrong?" "He is exhausted. He has a fever, and his lungs do not sound clear." Atlas tried to stand when Rachel reached for the leash. His front legs held. His back legs did not. Daniel caught him before he slipped, lowering him gently to the floor. Atlas. The dog blinked up at him, tail moving once against the tile. Daniel's face went pale. Stay with me. Rachel knelt beside them. We are taking him to the clinic. Right now. Daniel did not ask permission. He gathered Atlas against his chest, though his own arms trembled from weakness. Michael moved to help, but Daniel shook his head. I have him. He carried the dog through the hallway one careful step at a time. Atlas rested his head against Daniel's shoulder, the broken tag pressed between them. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold pavement. Rachel opened the back door of the truck and spread a blanket across the seat. Daniel climbed in beside Atlas and kept one hand over the dog's heart. As Michael pulled onto the highway, Daniel repeated the words he had once used during long nights and distant storms. Stay with me, partner. Atlas opened his eyes at the sound of Daniel's voice. Then, with the last of his strength, he pressed his nose into Daniel's palm. The veterinary clinic in Ashford opened its side entrance before Michael had fully stopped the truck. Rachel carried Atlas inside with Daniel walking beside her, one hand fixed against the dog's shoulder as though touch alone could keep him anchored. The treatment room was warm and bright, filled with the quiet hum of machines and the clean smell of antiseptic. Atlas lay beneath a heated blanket while Rachel listened to his lungs, checked his temperature, and started fluids through a line in his front leg. Daniel stood at the edge of the table, still wearing the gray sweater from the rehabilitation center. His face had gone colorless. Tell me the truth, he said. Rachel met his eyes. He is severely dehydrated. He has a respiratory infection, and he is weaker than he should be. But he is here. That matters. Daniel looked down at Atlas. He waited too long. He waited because he believed you were coming. Rachel adjusted the blanket. Now you are here, so give him a reason to stay. The words settled into Daniel with the weight of an order. He pulled a chair close and sat beside the table. Michael offered to bring him food. Nora offered to call the center. Daniel shook his head. He was not leaving. As evening deepened, rain clouds moved away from Ashford, revealing a narrow strip of stars above the clinic roof. Inside, time slowed to the rhythm of Atlas's breathing. Daniel kept one hand beneath the dog's jaw and spoke in a low voice. He told him about the White House, though he remembered only pieces. The porch step that leaned slightly to the left. The maple leaves that filled the gutters every fall. The blue bowl near the kitchen door. Each memory returned as he said it, drawn out by the warmth of fur beneath his palm. You used to steal my socks, Daniel murmured. Atlas did not open his eyes, but one ear shifted. Daniel almost smiled. Only the left once, never the right. Near midnight, Claire brought a small bag containing Daniel's belongings from the rehabilitation center. Inside was the other half of the dog tag. Daniel placed both pieces on the table beside Atlas. The broken edges touched, but the metal would never be whole again. He understood something then. Healing was not always the return of what had been. Sometimes it was learning how to carry the break without losing the bond. At 2 a.m, Atlas's breathing became shallower. Rachel increased the oxygen and asked Daniel to step back. He refused to leave the room, so she let him remain near the wall. The clinic seemed to hold its breath with him. No alarm sounded. No one raised their voice. There was only the soft whisper of oxygen, the ticking clock, and Daniel repeating the same words every few minutes. Stay with me, partner. He said it until the sentence lost language and became prayer. Just before dawn, exhaustion pulled his head toward the edge of the table. His fingers remained curled in Atlas's fur. A pale line of morning appeared across the blinds. Then something brushed against his wrist. Daniel lifted his head. Atlas's eyes were open. Not wide, not strong, but clear. His tail moved once beneath the blanket. A small, slow sweep. Daniel stared at it, afraid to breathe. Rachel looked over from the doorway and smiled without speaking. Daniel bent close until his forehead rested beside Atlas's. There you are, he whispered. Atlas pressed his nose weakly against Daniel's palm. Outside, the first sunlight touched the wet pavement. For 147 nights, Atlas had waited for Daniel to come home. Now, as morning entered the room, Daniel understood that home was not a place either of them had lost. It was this, one wounded soul refusing to leave the other alone. 6 months later, spring returned to Millhaven with clean blue mornings and the smell of wet earth rising from the fields. Daniel stood outside the small white house beneath the maple trees, fastening a leather leash to Atlas's collar. He had regained weight. His hair was shorter now. The gray-blue eyes were steadier, though some memories still came slowly, like distant lights through fog. Atlas had healed too. His coat had grown thick again, and the strength had returned to his legs. The faded red scarf still hung on a hook beside the door. Daniel kept it there because some kindness deserved a place in the home it helped save. They drove into town just before noon. Bus stop 17 looked smaller in daylight. The rusted roof had been repaired. The cracked glass had been replaced. The clock above the shelter worked again, its hands moving quietly past 12. Nora waited beside the bench with Michael, Rachel, Claire, and a small crowd of townspeople. Lily stood near the front, holding a new red scarf in both hands. Atlas recognized her and lowered his head so she could tie it around his neck. "You look better," she told him. His tail moved against Daniel's leg. Beside the shelter stood a wooden cabinet painted deep green. Inside were clean blankets, sealed bags of dog food, water bowls, spare leashes, and cards listing the telephone numbers of local shelters and veterinary clinics. A brass plate on the door carried 5 words. "No one waits alone here." Daniel ran his fingers across the letters. The idea had begun during his recovery, when he learned how many former service members lived in silence and how many shelter dogs waited behind fences for someone patient enough to see them. With help from the Veterans Center, Rachel's clinic, and people across Millhaven, Daniel had created a small program matching rescue dogs with veterans who needed companionship, routine, and a reason to step outside each morning. The first pair had met the week before. A quiet former Navy medic named Thomas and an older shepherd mix named June. Neither trusted easily. Both had returned the next day. Nora handed Daniel a narrow wooden frame. Inside rested the old bus ticket, softened by rain but still readable, and the 2 halves of the dog tag, placed side by side. Beneath them was a line Michael had written. He waited for a man who could not remember the road home. Then he became the road. Daniel read it once. Then again. He looked down at Atlas. "That sounds like you." Atlas leaned against his leg, unimpressed by praise but satisfied by presence. At 12:15, Bus 17 turned onto Main Street. The brakes sighed beneath the shelter, just as they had on every evening Atlas had waited. The doors opened. For a moment, he watched. Daniel felt the old ache move through him, not as pain now, but as memory. The driver smiled. "Coming aboard?" Daniel looked toward the road leading out of town, then toward Atlas. "Not today." The doors closed. The bus moved on. Atlas did not follow it with his eyes. He turned with Daniel and walked toward the truck, shoulder close to knee, the red scarf lifting gently in the breeze. Behind them, Lily placed a fresh bowl of water inside the green cabinet. Michael fixed one loose hinge. Nora folded a blanket on the lower shelf. Small acts. Quiet mercy. The kind that rarely makes noise, yet somehow reaches the places grief has kept locked for years. Daniel opened the passenger door, and Atlas climbed inside. Before starting the engine, Daniel held the joined dog tags in his palm. The break between them was still visible. It always would be. But when the sunlight touched the metal, both halves shone.